Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, and I have the pleasure today of talking with David Niose. He's the author of Non-Believer Nation, The Rise of Secular Americans, and he's also the president of the Secular Coalition of America. Hello, David.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Good to talk with you today. Want to go over certainly some parts of your book, and also a little bit of your background. I imagine that a lot of people who are watching will want to know about your journey. And so that's the first question for me is I'd like to know what did your religious background and journey and then your irreligious journey look like?
Sure. I grew up in New England in Massachusetts, and I was a working class Catholic boy growing up. I actually went to Catholic school through sixth grade, and would have called myself a Catholic even as a young adult, although by the time I was a young adult I had pretty much given up on the church. But like a lot of people, Catholic was just my fallback identity, even though I wasn't really a believer. And I would say I went through my adult life, my 20s and my 30s, pretty much apathetic about religion, really. If you asked me, I would have basically been a skeptic, but I was certainly not ardent about it, and I really didn't see it as a very important part of my identity or my personality. But it was when George W. Bush got elected, if you want to use that term, in the year 2000, that I really started to seriously consider my religious identity and my religious beliefs, because I saw the religious right as such a problem in this country. I think at that point in time, the religious right had been around for about 20 years, and I had always thought that the religious right would eventually just fade away, that it was certainly a passing thing. In American culture, we have trends that come and go, and this conservative religious trend would surely just fade away. But with the election of George W. Bush, it finally hit me that the religious right was not going to just fade away, that it was a very, very powerful institution. It had become more and more powerful over the years. And now with George W. Bush, we had a truly proud anti-intellectual, not just somebody who would pander to the religious right, but who was actually of them. He was one of them. He was meeting with them on a weekly basis to get policy input. And quite frankly, like a lot of people, that just scared the daylights out of me. And it really made me think about the importance of the secular demographic in America. And I began to put two and two together to realize that the rise of the religious right and the increasing power of the religious right and this country's entire lurch to the right, if you will, was very much a product of the stigmatization of the secular demographic. And if we were going to fight back against that, we needed a secular movement to give the secular demographic visibility and voice. And that's how I ended up a secular activist.
So in your mind, is secular humanism and secular as in the wall of separation between church and state, are those the same, or do you see the religious secularism and the political secularism as differently?
That's an interesting question, and I would say they are different. But the important thing is that the word secular, what does it mean? It basically means not religious. It doesn't mean anti-religious, it means not religious. So I think as a general statement, just about all Americans understand the value of secular government. In other words, the value of some level of church-state separation, and that government should not be run by theocrats, if you will. So there's secular government, as you just explained. But then there are people who are personally secular. In other words, personally not religious. And when I use the term for the movement, I generally refer to the secular demographic as being those people who are personally without religion. They might identify as atheist or agnostic or secular humanist or humanist, but the important thing is they are without religion, or to put a little bit of an asterisk next to that, they might even be religious, such as Unitarian Universalists and ethical culturists, that sort of thing, but they are not theistic. Secular has come to mean, if not religious, at least not theistic. So when we talk about the secular demographic, there's quite a lot of subgroups to that. There's all the ones I just mentioned, and then there's a lot of people who choose no label at all. They're just not religious. That's probably the biggest subgroup under the secular demographic. People who will not call themselves atheist or agnostic or humanist. They'll just say, I'm not religious.
It's not on my radar in any way, shape, or form, in
That's
other
right.
words, in some way.
Absolutely.
And we read a lot about the rise of the nuns now.
Now, you're not talking about women
No,
wearing habits.
the NONESs and the rise of the nuns. What do you ascribe that to?
Well, the nuns, just for the audience's benefit, the nuns are people who, when asked about religious identity, just say none, N-O-N-E. And this demographic has risen in quite a bit. In the 90s, it was only about 8% of the population. By 2008, it was about 15% of the population. It doubled in just over a decade. And now it's about 20% of the population and over 30% of people under 30. So it's a growing group. And I think it's really just common sense to see where they're coming from. They're not embracing the identity atheist or agnostic, but they are simply saying, you know, religion, no thanks, I don't need that, because they find their values and their just daily life not needing religious input. Mm-hmm. And that's something we're seeing worldwide, not just in the United States.
Well, and I find that interesting. As a baby boomer, I grew up in a culture in which religion was so important, and it essentially defined people. The Roman Catholics didn't talk to the Pentecostals, and vice versa, and those kinds of things.
Right. It was a big deal for a Catholic to marry a Protestant. That would send both families into turmoil.
And as a matter, it could even drive Pentecostals to drink. I would think, but. And so a lot of people from my generation are very reactive then against religion. When we get away from it, we rebel against it and we attack it, and maybe we even turn into those new atheists, who all of whom I think are baby boomers, as a matter of fact. What do you see as the difference with your generation and younger people? They don't seem to have that reactivity anymore.
Well, I think you're right. I think there's a few things going on. One is that the baby boomer generation, and by the way, I might not be quite as young as you think, because the baby boom ended in 1964, so I'm technically a baby boomer, although not in the heart of it. So my generation, and really I think we're talking about generations younger than mine, look at religion much differently than baby boomers and older generations do. One interesting thing to look at is their view towards the atheist identity. Okay, if you talk to baby boomers who grew up, of course, during the Cold War and have all the baggage of McCarthyism with them, you use the word atheist and they'll say, "Oh, I don't believe in God, but I won't call myself an atheist because you know it has a bad stigma to it. People associate atheism with communism, and I don't want to be thought of that way." Well, I mentioned that to a young lady at a Secular Student Alliance conference last year. I was going around talking to college students, and I talked about how there's this stigma with atheism because people associate atheism with communism. She looked at me very puzzled, and she said, "That's so 20th century." And you really see the difference, and it hits home. You know, the Cold War has been over for over 20 years. We don't remember that always, but young people just don't see religion and secularity the same way that older folks do. And that's a wonderful thing. I think it's something that helps them embrace it a little easier. And they also see just how off the cliff this country has gone as a result of the religious right as well. And they react to that. You're saying, sometimes the embrace of secularity is a reaction. I think even with younger people, that's part of it, that because they see just how crazy and wingnut a lot of public policy has gotten due to conservative fundamentalist religion just pushing its agenda more and more, with some of these characters coming out of the woodwork who never would have been able to make it in politics a generation ago. And they just see that and they say, you know what, the easiest way to stand up and say I'm not with them is to just say, you know what, I'm an atheist. Okay, we know where she's coming from, don't we?
Well, and then how do you be an atheist in Texas or Mississippi?
I'll tell you, there's more of them than you may realize. I think we tend to oversimplify and stereotype the country quite a bit, and we paint a red brush over the Bible Belt and say, oh, well, they're all fundamentalists down there. I was president of the American Humanist Association for 4 years, and I found when I was going around talking with different groups that the strongest humanist groups were the groups in the Bible Belt. If you're living in New York City and you happen to be an atheist or agnostic, well, big deal. There's secularity all around you and whatnot. But if you're down in Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina, years ago you would have thought you were all alone. But now, because of the web, social media, and meetup.com and things like that, these atheists and agnostics are finding out that they're not alone. You live in Columbia, South Carolina, you go on the internet and you go to meetup.com and put in atheist groups, and you find out that there's a group meeting right around the corner every Tuesday night or whatever, and it's got hundreds of members. And it's not so hard to be an atheist or an agnostic in the Bible Belt anymore. In fact, they're finding a lot of solidarity and community.
Well, I think that's what I found most fascinating about your book, is that it's really a call. It's a call to step up among atheists and agnostics, and to say we are secular, we have secular values. Can you say more about that? And I know you travel around the country, and do people hear that call?
I think they do. They certainly do. In fact, it's not just that they hear it from me, but they see it all over the country. What I'm doing, I guess you could say that Non-Believer Nation is pushing this movement a little bit, but in many ways it's simply just documenting it and reflecting it and showing what's happening in this country. A lot of people are unaware of it because we go about our daily lives and we don't see the secular movement in the news every day. But there is certainly a very real movement happening in this country. And the way that I describe it is that it's an identity-oriented movement. For the first time in the last decade or so, seculars began to realize the importance of their secular identity and the power of that identity by standing up and demanding a place at the table. It's really analogous to the gay rights movement in a lot of ways. There have been, I'm not suggesting that there are a lot more seculars in this country than there used to be. I think there are more, and it's a growing demographic. But I think more importantly than that, what's really happening is that the seculars who are out there are realizing the importance of it and the importance of coming out of the closet, so to speak. How did the gay rights movement do what it did over the last 3 or 4 decades? Through an identity-oriented approach, by taking the shame away from the identity and standing up and say, you know what, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this identity. This is who I am. And that's what seculars are discovering as well.
But if I'm a very religious person, I'm going to say, this country has always been one nation under God. And if we take that away, what will we have left?
Well, I think the first thing you need to know is that this nation has not always been one nation under God, that's for sure. We could run through all the culture war issues that are so hot button, the different issues like In God We Trust as the national motto, Under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, how we have an annual National Day of Prayer now. You know what, all 3 of those things only came into being in the 1950s. during the height of the McCarthy era. So a lot of people, and this is what happens with fundamentalist religion having an influence, is that once they get their foot in the door, if they wait long enough, nobody remembers that it used to be different. I know people now who certainly believe that under God, well, first of all, they think the Pledge of Allegiance was written back in the founding era, and they assume that it always contained the under God language. The truth is the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist in the 1890s, and it did not include any under God language. The under God language was inserted through lobbying by the Knights of Columbus in the 1950s during the McCarthy era to differentiate America from the communist Soviet Union. But we certainly don't have time to get into it all here, but I documented, I think, pretty well in the book, the rich secular tradition of this country. And it truly is a very rich tradition. And I don't go so far as to suggest that, you know, all the founding fathers were non-believers and they wanted government to be anti-religion. No, you know, let's look at it objectively and just realistically what really happened. And the truth is, you know, they wanted a secular government, that's for sure. And they wanted to separate church and state. There's really no doubt about that. And none of them, even though they lived in the 1700s, okay, long before all of the great scientific discoveries that we're living with now, even then, they would never have been described as fundamentalist Christians, as fundamentalist Christians are today, who should really know better. They have the benefit of all the knowledge and scientific advancement that the founders did not have.
Well, you probably know that one of the arguments for why the United States is still very religious as compared to Western Europe is that we do have this wall of separation between church and state, and therefore we have a lot of variety.
That's a theory, and I think it's or a hypothesis anyway, and I think there's some validity to it. We have no state religion, therefore there's a marketplace of religion, and America always loves a marketplace. And we have free speech, so you know, we allow these people to you know, share their ideas and to proselytize. We also have great tax benefits and other reasons that make it very easy to start you know, a storefront church and to build a religious community if you want to do that. There's a lot of factors that go into it. That being said, I think we need to be careful about the tendency to quickly call this a very religious nation. I object to that very quickly, and that's kind of what you're saying is that, well, that's one reason why religion is so alive and well in America. And, you know, compared to most other developed countries, we are more religious. Yes, that's true, but I think we can't take that stereotype too far. America is not as religious as a lot of people, even seculars, tend to say. Only about half the population goes to church regularly. Okay, I mean, how religious is that? We have great appreciation for secularity in popular culture, in arts, in film, in comedy. You know, think of George Carlin and just about any comedian, the great fun we all have watching them poke fun at religion. It is an easy target after all. And you know, the Monty Python movies and just all, there's so much secularity in popular culture. If you really think about it, America is a very secular nation, but there's this fence of piety that seems to get constructed around the realm of politics. Once we start going into the realm of politics, especially as a candidate, our rhetoric must become very religious and you know, pious, and we're a very religious country. We need to think about that stereotype. Why do we jump on it so quickly? This is why we don't have atheists and agnostics being elected, at least open atheists and agnostics, being elected to Congress and to public office just about anywhere. It's why we have so much fundamentalist religion in government. There's more fundamentalist religion in government than there really is in the culture as a whole. And there's less secularity, much less than there is in the culture as a whole. And we should realize that that correlation is part of the cause of why our public policy is so dysfunctional and why our public dialogue is so dysfunctional. And this is why the secular movement is so important, to push back against that.
I'm always fascinated with research that shows that places that are more secular are also, well, more progressive, but also there's a lower murder rate, there's lower alcoholism rate, there's lower teen pregnancy rate. How can that be?
It's really true. If you look at social problems, you know, one of the reasons people defend religion, if you will, is they say, well, if nothing else, it gives us morality, and it's, you know, it's a protection against social problems. Well, the reality is not so favorable. In fact, just the opposite, quite frankly. And I know I sound like a zealous advocate attacking religion, but really, objectively, the truth is that social problems almost always correlate greatly with more religious societies. We're talking about murder rates, violent crime rates, teen pregnancy rates. Just you could run down a list of social problems. Almost always, if you compare those rates in more religious societies and less religious societies, you will see that they stack up strongly, not just a little bit, strongly on the religious side. And that applies, interestingly enough, internationally when we compare the more religious United States to more secular countries such as Western Europe and Scandinavia. All the social problems are much greater in the United States. And it also applies internally within the United States when you compare more religious states to less religious states. Again, the social problems, the murder rates and all that. Now, somebody could hear that and they could say, well, you know, there's other reasons for this. Correlation does not equal cause, right? That's the old argument. And I agree with that. I'm not going to try to push the argument too much to say religion causes social problems. I think there are some discussions to be had there as far as anti-intellectualism and appreciation of education, but generally, let's go with that. Okay, correlation does not equal cause. But what we're talking about here is equality, is whether it's right to discriminate and to dislike secularity in secular people, atheists and agnostics. Well, certainly if the correlation is that strong against religion and in faith, you can't say that secularity causes the problems. Okay, maybe religion doesn't cause the problems, but certainly secularity doesn't cause the problems, right? We're talking about equality here, and I think there's just no rational, logical argument to say that somehow an increased visibility for the secular demographic and more respect for the secular demographic is going to cause all hell to break loose for social problems in the United States or anywhere for that matter.
And I think you proved that, but I want to be careful because I was pre-convinced when I started reading your book. So let's think about, I'm a high school student in an unnamed state, since we don't want to be too hard on some states. And I've been reading on the internet. Maybe my parents are vaguely Roman Catholic, but have only gone on Christmas or whatever. And so I decided I'm an atheist. And I go to my high school and show up in the morning, and by golly, I am asked to stand up. I don't know if kids do this anymore, but put their hand on their heart. I did in my day, and say one nation under God. What recourse do I have as that high school student when I get sent to the office and get expelled, and I don't want my parents to know what I'm doing?
Well, that's an interesting question. That issue, believe it or not, was actually resolved by the Supreme Court back in the 1940s. There's a Supreme Court case called Barnett. And the Barnett case is actually not a freedom of religion case. And it's not, it has nothing to do with the Establishment Clause. It's a free speech case. It was a Jehovah's Witness who objected to saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Not, at that time, the under God wording wasn't even in it yet. It was just one nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all. But the Jehovah's Witness child objected to saluting the flag at all, and he was disciplined for it. And the case went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided that on free speech grounds, the child had an absolute right to not have to say the pledge. So no child in America can be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance for any reason. It's a free speech matter, and you can sit it out. Now, whether the school has the right to tell your parents that you're not saying it, probably, but that's less of an issue, I think, from a legal standpoint. What's interesting, though, is now that they've inserted under God into the Pledge of Allegiance, it really has become even more of a religious issue. The Jehovah's Witness case could have been analyzed from a religion issue, from a religion standpoint, but the Supreme Court, probably wisely back in that day, decided to look at it from a free speech standpoint instead. But now that it's got under God in it, there are children who do not want to say it just because of the under God language, and they have the right not to. But I think the larger question is whether the state should be sponsoring an exercise every day that exalts God belief and really stigmatizes atheism, because after all, it is an indoctrinational exercise. I think everyone would agree on that. We have our children say the Pledge of Allegiance every day, or we have our schools sponsor an exercise every day for indoctrinational reasons. We want our children to love their country and to be patriotic, and whether it works or not, I think, is open to debate, but that's the reason behind it. So we're instilling patriotism and we're defining patriotism by exalting a certain kind of religious belief and stigmatizing another. Is that fair? Is that discrimination? I think clearly it is. And in a very long-winded way, I'm leading into a point I make in the book, is that we have a case pending now in Massachusetts arguing just that. We're objecting to the law requiring schools to conduct the daily pledge exercise, not because the children don't have the right to sit it out, they do, but we're saying it's wrong to discriminate in that way. And we're not using any Establishment Clause or First Amendment arguments, but we're approaching it from a purely equal protection, equal rights discrimination standpoint.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. Well, you were talking about how you had been a Roman Catholic in Boston, and I grew up a Pentecostal in the South. In my day, and perhaps in yours as well, it was very difficult to hear anything other than what the 2 or 3 churches in town, in the small towns where I grew up, all flavors of Protestantism, for example. Is it getting better for people because of the internet with information?
Yeah, I think there's more and more pluralism out there than there ever was. You're right. Back in the day, it was Catholic or Protestant pretty much in most small towns. And in larger cities, they might be Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. But in most small towns, it was. It reminds me of the Blues Brothers movie when Jake and Elwood walk into the bar out in the country, and they ask, "What kind of music do you play here?" And she says, "Both kinds, country and Western." It's kind of the Americans for a long time tended to think, well, we've got both kinds of religion, Catholic and Protestant. But now if you go into schools, even in relatively small towns out in the suburbs, you'll see kids who are Wiccans or who are Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims. It's a much more pluralistic country than it ever was before. And I think that really speaks to the need to remove theistic language especially from indoctrinational exercises that kind of define patriotism in a certain way.
It is interesting that, again, with the Christian basis of the country, certainly the U.S. mail stops on Christmas. How do we ever in this nation get past this underpinning of we will take Christmas off because Why? Because I guess the only secular holiday, strangely enough, is Thanksgiving, isn't it?
You know, interestingly enough, in the founding era, Christmas was not a holiday. They worked on Christmas. Christmas became a holiday. It really has very little to do with religion. It has more to do with commercialism. In the 19th century, shopkeepers found a great way to encourage people to spend, and the rest is history. It has little to do with the nativity scene being so holy that anyone wanted to take the day off. You know, how do you fight back against this? One way is to educate people as much as possible, and another thing is to really pick the fights, I think. You know, there are some instances where there might be an arguable infringement of church-state separation, you know, and there are probably battles to fight and battles not to fight. I think some of the higher profile ones, as far as symbolic issues that really convince people that this is a Christian nation incorrectly, are the Pledge of Allegiance and also the national motto of "In God We Trust," which was adopted only in the 1950s. Before that, the de facto motto of this country was "E pluribus unum," which was actually the motto of the country from before the Constitution. The Constitution was adopted in the late 1780s. "E pluribus unum" was put on the Great Seal of the United States in the early 1780s during the Articles of Confederation. And everyone just thought that was our motto, and it's Latin for "out of many, one." And that's really a beautiful statement of what this country is all about. Out of many states, one nation, and also the pluralism of this country. Out of many peoples, one American people. It's really profound if you think about it. A beautiful motto. But in the 1950s, at the height of McCarthyism, what do we have? We have you know, this God-fearing mentality where all of a sudden, "In God we trust" is our national motto. I mean, that's a complete sentence if you think about it. We could put a period at the end of that. "In God we trust." They're dictating to you. You know, and that's really an attack on the pluralistic nature of this country. And these are the things that I think we need to fight and we need to change. And of course, there are a lot of other smaller battles. There's things happening in state government, local government, and in schools where they're just pushing religion more and more, trying to teach creationism. There's a lot of fights out there. I don't necessarily think we need to fight every single one of them, but we need to pick our battles carefully and strategize and push identity, not just that the government crossed a line, church-state separation, you cross that line, no, no, no. No, instead, approach it from an identity standpoint. Look, there's a demographic here. There's secular Americans who are being discriminated against. We won't stand for it anymore.
Why is it that secular people also tend to be politically progressive, do you think?
That's an interesting question, and I don't pretend to have the final word on it. I would preface any answer by saying it is just a general statement, and there are conservative seculars out there. There are quite a few, actually. I think, I don't know exactly how it breaks down, but it is true that people who are not religious, when you look at the polling data after an election, tend to vote liberal more than just about any other religious category. So, in fact, Obama's strongest supporters, voting for him almost 70 to 30, or maybe even over 70 to 30, were seculars. Whereas every other, even supporters, were not so strongly stacked up in that way. So why? I think you know, secularism tends to really focus on the rational and the empirical, what policy positions are supported by science. And I think, honestly, I'm a progressive myself, so you might be asking the wrong person, but I think progressive politics tend to go that way. I think that's why you see more progressive political scenes in Europe, where there are more seculars. There are open agnostics and atheists holding office, running, and there are just more in the electorate. And what do you see? more social democracy, less just irrational, fear-oriented politics, which, quite frankly, a lot of what comes from the right is exactly that, irrational, fear-oriented, not based on science.
Yeah. As a minister, I'm a Unitarian minister, and so when I look at the numbers and I see things like the question, can religion survive the internet? The reason I ask you that question. And the rise of the nuns. But yet, I'm still thinking, as a Unitarian minister, about community, about connection, about organized secularity, if you will, not organized religion. Almost everyone in my congregation is agnostic or atheist. But what's the future for groups of secular people? I think that a lot of us see secularity as perhaps a fragmented kind of movement, totally unconnected.
Yeah, it is a great question. It really is, because I agree community is very important, and I think community is going to look a little bit different depending on where you are and what kind of society you're in. I mean, the Midwest is different than the Northeast, and both are different than California, and they're all different than the South. And even within those regions, there's a lot of different types of places. So it's going to vary from here to there. But I would say there is a place for religious secularity, if you will. The UUA is a great example of it. You can be personally secular, in other words, personally non-theistic, but still attach yourself to a religious community. And I would hope to see the UUA grow quite a bit in years to come as a result of more people being personally secular and looking for religious community and finding it in the UUA, because it is important. And the UUA has many great things to offer. They have one of the best childhood education programs. They teach children about all world religions without being judgmental, without telling children, and here's all world religions, and here's where you should go. That's what a lot of, I remember my Catholic upbringing. It's like, here, we'll tell you about the Muslims, and these, but here, the Catholic.
We got it right.
Right, exactly. The UUA really has a very admirable program that way, and a lot of other things about the UUA too. So that's one thing. Aside from that, though, I would say that there's also room for humanist communities. There are humanist chapters of the American Humanist Association, and there's a group called the Humanist Community Project being run out of the Harvard chaplaincy at Harvard University, where they're trying to promote community, and there are other smaller religious groups such as Ethical Culture. So all of these have potential to grow as the country becomes more secular. Besides all of that, though, I would also say that more secular cultures tend to find other ways of providing community. And I think Western Europe is a good example. You see in Western Europe, you see a vibrant civic life. You find people getting connections through their unions or through their political parties and through their activism, through their just engagement in the community. And there's that outlet as well. I think if you are engaged in your municipality, you're going to be having community in some form or another. And public education is a great place for families to come together and find community. So there are ways, there are post-theological ways of having community, if you will.
Let's assume that what we're doing right now will appear on the internet, and perhaps someone in a very isolated community will be watching and wondering about how to get connected with this movement, because everyone he or she knows is conservative and religious, shall we say. What shall I Google as a person who wants to know more about secularity in America?
Well, I would say one good place to start would be the Secular Coalition for America, which is a coalition of 11 groups. So that there are 11 secular groups that are united under the Secular Coalition to provide secular activism or secular community in some form or another. There's the American Humanist Association, there's American Atheists, there's the Humanists, which is the Unitarian Universalist Humanist group, and there are a number of others. So I think if you went to the Secular Coalition's website, secular.org, and looked at the member groups, and you can find a link to all 11 of them there, you could probably find the flavor of secularity that suits you, or at least you could find maybe 2 or 3 that interest you, and you could check them out and find out which one, or maybe more than one, really strikes you as being your kind of secular group. But there's a lot of activism going on out there, and all of these groups have web pages and they have Facebook pages. You know, the American Humanist Association has over 125,000 followers on Facebook.
Wow.
Back 10 years ago, when I first really connected with the AHA, they had no Facebook page, of course, because there was no Facebook, but they had about 6,000 to 7,000 members nationwide, and those members heard from the group every couple of months. You'd get a newsletter or a magazine or something like that. Well, now there's 125 plus thousand, and these people are not just hearing from the group every couple months, but if you're connected on Facebook, which they are, you are hearing from the AHA daily. You're getting a steady stream of information about what's happening in the movement, what important issues are happening politically or socially, where atheists or agnostics and humanists are being discriminated against and what you can do about it. You're getting action alerts so that you can send a letter instantly to your legislator if you want to do that. It's just very much the feel of a movement. It's not just a club of intellectuals who want to complain about religion, but it's a real movement of like-minded people who have similar values. And if you are a progressive, then something like the AHA would be right up your alley, because humanism is kind of, I see as the progressive wing of the secular movement, if you will. Whereas if you're an atheist, you might be conservative. You could be a humanist as well. You can be an atheist and a humanist. But the AHA is kind of a stalwart progressive politics type of humanism. And there are other groups under the Secular Coalition that are as well.
Okay. You don't seem like a sad, depressed atheist to me. Many of our religious friends would say, where's the wonder? Where's the awe in a life where there is no God?
Well, my response to that would be, why do you need to create this character? And that's what God is. Whether you believe in Him or not, it's this character who's out there to have wonder and awe. In fact, I think if you remove that character, since there is no proof of his or her or its existence, the world becomes even more wondrous, because you have to look at things for real answers that cannot be provided with the simple sentence, well, God did it, or it's God's will. That's pretty easy to say, and it's kind of a conversation stopper. You can't really argue with it. There's quite a bit of wonder and awe. I wouldn't describe Albert Einstein as a man who was without wonder and awe, yet he was a humanist. He was very much a humanist. And so many others. The American Humanist Association has a list of Humanists of the Year. It gives an award every year called Humanist of the Year Award. And these are it's like a who's who of 20th century intellectuals and activists, people like Carl Sagan, Isaac Asimov, and so many others. You should go to their website, americanhumanist.org, and look at it. But there is plenty of wonder and awe out there without the need for, I'm not going to use a derogatory term for the theistic character, but some would, but you just don't need that kind of thing. You just don't need it, or at least many of us don't.
Of course, I remember the rise of the religious right, and with horror. let's think about Jerry Falwell and his moral majority, they certainly became kingmakers in the 1980s and chose the agenda of the Republican Party for quite some time. Do you think that maybe he was planting seeds of the nuns and of secularity as well then?
Well, I do attribute the rise of the secular demographic and the modern secular movement, which is really only about a decade or so old, to the rise of the religious right. So I believe he did, unwittingly, of course. But just look what's happened over the last few decades. I mean, Barry Goldwater, who was Mr. Republican, back in his day. He retired in the late 1980s, but he was Mr. Conservative, Mr. Republican. He saw the religious right doing what it was doing, and he called them a bunch of kooks. He was very concerned about what they would do to his party, and now with the benefit of hindsight, we can see he had reason to be concerned because the GOP has really gone off a cliff in terms of losing connection to rationality.
It has been great talking with you.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks for having me.
Read that book, look up the websites, and definitely look into the work. It's a rising movement. It's a rising tide of progressivism and not a sad, awless movement at all. And it's been so great talking with you and learning a little more about that.
Well, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Great.